You're too ordinary for the kind of future I actually want, my fiancée said before leaving to chase a more luxurious lifestyle with someone else. I didn't try to convince her. Months later, she saw my name attached to something she never expected me to build. You're too ordinary for the kind of future I actually want. She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing for weeks. Clean. Practiced. No hesitation. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there in our kitchen, holding a mug I'd had since college, listening to the refrigerator hum in the background like it hadn't noticed the world had just shifted. I'm not trying to be cruel, Morgan added. I'm being honest. I nodded slowly. Because that's the thing about a sentence like that. It doesn't leave you much room to argue. You either defend yourself and prove her point, or you go quiet and let it land. I went quiet. At the time, I thought she was judging who I was. Months later, she'd discover she had completely misjudged who I could become. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 34 when this happened. Morgan was 31. We'd been together for 4 years, engaged for 11 months. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey, with a view of the Manhattan skyline that she used to love and eventually stopped mentioning. I worked in operations consulting. Nothing glamorous. I helped mid-sized companies find inefficiencies in their supply chains and fix them. I was good at it. I made a solid income. I was methodical, disciplined, and genuinely interested in the work. Morgan worked in brand marketing for a lifestyle company based in Midtown. She was sharp, creative, and deeply interested in aesthetics, which was one of the things that had drawn me to her. She had an eye for what looked good and what didn't. The problem, I'd eventually understand, was that she started applying that same eye to our relationship. And somewhere along the way, we stopped looking good to her. The first time I noticed something shifting, we were at a rooftop birthday party in Chelsea for a mutual friend named Caitlin. The kind of party where everyone is dressed intentionally and the drinks cost more than lunch, and someone always arrives with a story you're meant to be impressed by. That's where Morgan met Brandon. Not officially, not in any way I could point to and say, there, that's the moment. It was more gradual than that. He was in the orbit of a few people we knew. Finance background. Mid-30s. Wore the kind of watch you notice without meaning to. I remember Morgan laughing at something he said across the room. I didn't think anything of it. I should have paid closer attention to what happened after. It started small, the way most erosions do. A comment here. A comparison there. We'd be deciding where to eat on a Saturday, and she'd mentioned that Brandon had taken a group to some new place in Tribeca that apparently had a 3-week wait list. I'd suggest the Thai place we both genuinely loved, and she'd go along with it. But something in her expression had already checked out before we left the apartment. I'm not saying we have to spend more, she told me once when I gently pointed it out. I'm just noticing that some people live very differently than we do. I asked her what she meant by differently. She paused like she was searching for the right word. Expansively, she finally said. I thought about that word for days. My best friend Mitchell noticed before I was ready to. We'd known each other since our mid-20s, worked in adjacent industries, met for lunch near Penn Station every few weeks when our schedules allowed. He was the kind of person who said things plainly without making you feel stupid for not seeing them yourself. She's been spending time with that guy from Caitlin's party, he said one afternoon over sandwiches. She has mutual friends with him, I said. So do I, technically. I know, Mitchell said. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing. I told him I trusted Morgan. And I did. That wasn't the issue. The issue was something I hadn't fully named yet. That trust and attention aren't the same thing, and I'd been confusing one for the other. There was a dinner party at Vanessa's apartment that April. Vanessa was Morgan's closest friend, a sharp, social woman who hosted gatherings that felt like they were part networking event, part performance. I'd always liked her well enough, but I never felt entirely comfortable at her dinners. Everyone seemed to be auditioning for something. Brandon was there. He'd recently moved into a new place in the West Village. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Building with a rooftop pool. He mentioned it twice in conversation, both times in ways that were designed to sound casual. Morgan asked follow-up questions both times. I watched her face while she listened to him. There was something alive in her expression that I hadn't seen in a while. Not attraction exactly, or at least not only that. It was more like appetite. Like she was looking at a version of a life she hadn't known she wanted until she saw it up close. On the cab ride home, she was quiet. I asked her if she had a good time. I always have a good time at Vanessa's, she said. She didn't ask me the same question back. The comparisons became less subtle after that. She'd leave her phone open to real estate listings in neighborhoods we couldn't realistically afford. She started making comments about my car, not directly, but in the way people criticize things while technically talking about something else. She mentioned once, during an argument about something unrelated, that she felt like we'd been standing still. Standing still, I repeated. Professionally, financially, like we're comfortable but not. She stopped. Not what? I asked. Not going anywhere exciting. I asked her to define exciting. She couldn't, or wouldn't. That was the night I started to understand that we weren't having an argument about money. We were having an argument about identity. My business associate Wesley had been trying to get my attention for months. We'd met 2 years earlier through a professional network and had talked loosely about the possibility of co-founding something together. A consulting firm with a narrower focus than where I was currently working, targeting a specific gap in how mid-market companies handled operational scale during growth phases. The idea was solid. I'd known that since the first conversation, but I'd been cautious. I was always cautious. Not from fear, from discipline. I didn't want to move until I had enough clarity to move well. That spring, I started taking the conversations with Wesley more seriously. We began meeting on Tuesday evenings, first at a coffee shop near Grand Central, eventually at a small shared office space he'd rented in Midtown. We brought in a project manager named Logan to stress test our model. We started drafting the framework for what a real launch could look like. Morgan knew I was meeting someone for work stuff. She didn't ask for details. I want to be honest about something. I wasn't a perfect partner in those final months. Not because I was unfaithful or absent in any dramatic way, but because I had started to pull some of my attention inward, toward the business concept that was quietly taking shape, toward the parts of my professional ambition I'd been deferring without fully realizing it. Morgan wanted visible momentum, tangible proof that our life was accelerating. I was building something that had no visible surface yet. She couldn't see it. I'm not sure I had the language to show her. I found out through Garrett. Garrett had been a friend of mine for almost a decade. Steady, low drama. The kind of person who texted you back in 10 minutes and remembered your coffee order. He ran in a wider social circle than I did and had overlapping connections with both Brandon's group and ours. He called me on a Wednesday evening in late May. I think you need to know something, he said, and I want you to hear it from me. He told me that Morgan had been seen at dinner with Brandon 3 times in the past month. Once as part of a larger group, twice without one. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I don't know if it means anything, Garrett said carefully. I know, I said. Thank you for telling me. I sat with that information for 2 days before I said anything to Morgan. Not because I was afraid, because I wanted to be clear-headed when I did. She didn't deny it. She also didn't apologize. What she said instead was that she'd been doing a lot of thinking. About us, about her future, about what she actually wanted her life to look like. And I said. She looked at me for a long moment. You're a good person, she said. You're stable and reliable, and I know you care about me. But, I said, I think I need something different. Someone who moves differently through the world. Someone whose life has, she paused again, more altitude. Altitude, I said. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you've made a decision, I said. She looked at the floor. I think I have. That's when she said it. Not cruelly, but not gently either. You're too ordinary for the kind of future I actually want. I looked at her for a long moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I didn't run through the list of everything I'd done and every sacrifice I'd made and every way I'd tried to build a real life for us. I just said, okay. She blinked, like she'd expected more. That's it, she said. That's it, I said. And I meant it. I wasn't going to beg someone to see value they'd already decided wasn't there. I wasn't going to negotiate my worth. I wasn't going to perform a version of myself that might temporarily change her mind only to have the same conversation 6 months later. I knew who I was. I also knew something she didn't. I knew what I was building. The engagement ended that week. She moved out before the month was over. Efficient, composed, no scenes. A few mutual friends reached out with careful, diplomatic messages. I kept most of my responses short. I didn't explain myself publicly, didn't share my version of events, didn't try to shape the narrative. The ring went back into the small velvet box I'd kept in the top drawer of my dresser. I didn't know what to do with it, so I just left it there. And then I went to work. The weeks after the end of an engagement are strange. Not always in obvious ways. There's no single moment of grief. It's more like the absence of a future you'd already started rehearsing. You catch yourself reaching for plans that no longer exist. You find a reservation confirmation in your email for a weekend trip that won't be happening. You notice the second coffee mug has been relocated to the back of the cabinet. I let myself feel all of it. I didn't rush past it or numb it or turn it into fuel for something dramatic. I just sat with it, the way you sit with any difficult thing, until it became a little more manageable. And then I got up and moved forward. Wesley and I formally incorporated in July. I'd spent the previous 6 weeks with our attorney Bennett going over the structure, the equity split, the operational framework, and the initial client target list that Logan had been building out. Wesley brought a financial advisor named Carter into the conversation. We were careful. We moved deliberately. We called the company Groundwork Advisory. The name was intentional. Everything we did was about the work that happened beneath the surface, the structural analysis, the operational infrastructure, the unglamorous problem-solving that determined whether a company could actually scale or just appear to be scaling. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed to be, but it was real. The summer was the most focused period of my professional life. I was up by 5:30 most mornings. Not because I forced myself, but because I was genuinely interested in what the day had in store. There's a particular kind of energy that comes from working on something you built from the ground up, something that exists entirely because you decided it should. It's different from anything a job title can give you. I barely posted anything on social media during that period. Not as a strategy. I just didn't have anything I needed to say publicly. I was too busy actually doing things. My longtime friend Garrett checked in periodically. So did Mitchell. I told them both the same thing. I was fine, and I was focused, and I'd fill them in when there was something worth filling them in on. Neither of them pushed. That's what real friendship looks like. Meanwhile, through fragments and the unavoidable social overlap that happens in any city, I began to hear things about Morgan. Not in a way I sought out. Just in the way information finds its way to you when you're connected to enough people who are connected to each other. She had moved in with Brandon by August. The West Village apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows. I imagined it looked exactly the way she'd wanted something to look for years. But Sierra, Morgan's younger sister, who had always been quietly fond of me, reached out once with a message that was brief but telling. "I hope you're doing okay," she wrote. I think she thought it would feel different than it does. I thanked her and didn't ask for more detail. I didn't want it. What I would eventually learn, in pieces, through Caitlin and through Garrett and through the general atmosphere of social circles that never stay fully sealed, was that Brandon's life looked considerably more stable from the outside than it was on the inside. He wasn't fraudulent. It wasn't that simple. But he was leveraged in ways that required constant maintenance. The apartment was financed through arrangements that depended on things remaining stable. His income was significant but uneven, the kind of money that looks enormous in good months and disappears in complex ones. He was always moving, always in motion, always arriving somewhere, just as something else was quietly unraveling behind him. Morgan, who had a sharp eye for aesthetics, had initially mistaken his velocity for direction. They're not the same thing. She would figure that out slowly. Our first major client came in September. A mid-size e-commerce company based in New Jersey that had grown faster than their internal systems could handle. They were profitable but chaotic, the kind of chaotic that looks fine from the outside and creates invisible damage from within. They'd been turned down or deprioritized by 2 larger consulting firms that had too much on their plates. We came in with a specific proposal. Targeted. Honest about what we could and couldn't do. They signed with us inside 2 weeks. I remember walking back through Penn Station after our first formal meeting with their leadership team, the city moving around me in its usual relentless way, and feeling something I hadn't felt in longer than I could pinpoint. Clarity. Not excitement. Not ego. Just the clean, quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Wesley brought in an investor named Sawyer in October. I'd met Sawyer once before, briefly, at an industry dinner I'd attended almost on a whim the previous year. He was the kind of person who asked specific questions and remembered the answers, which told you most of what you needed to know about how he operated. He spent 90 minutes with Wesley and me in a conference room in Lower Manhattan, asking about the model, the pipeline, the long-term positioning. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't perform enthusiasm. At the end of the meeting, he said, "I think this is a smarter approach than most people will recognize for another 18 months. That's usually where the good money is." He came in at a number that changed what we could actually build. That fall, I also began working with a community leader named Madison on a pro bono initiative we'd quietly developed in parallel with the main business. It was a program designed to bring operational consulting resources to small, community-based businesses in underserved neighborhoods, the kind of businesses that had real potential but no access to the structural support that larger companies took for granted. We weren't doing it for the press. We were doing it because Wesley and I both came from backgrounds where we'd watched businesses fail not from lack of effort or lack of ideas, but from lack of infrastructure. We knew what that looked like. We didn't want to be another consulting firm that only worked for people who already had everything. Madison was extraordinary, practical, visionary, deeply connected to the communities she served. She introduced us to a nonprofit director named Qley who expanded our reach in ways we hadn't anticipated. None of it made us any money that year. All of it mattered anyway. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't trying to prove Morgan wrong. I wasn't building anything to eventually wave in her face. I wasn't running a quiet counter-narrative. I wasn't keeping score. I was building because it was time to build. Because I'd been deferring this version of myself longer than I should have, and the thing that had ended my engagement, as painful as it was, had removed the last reason I'd been giving myself to wait. It wasn't about her. It never really was. The conference came in February, an industry gathering focused on operational innovation and scaling businesses, held at a venue in Midtown. Our marketing director, Abigail, had submitted groundwork advisory for consideration as a featured case study months earlier, largely on the strength of the results we'd delivered for our first client and 2 others we'd brought on in the fall. I found out we'd been selected in November. A conference host named Harper reached out personally to discuss how we'd be featured. A combination of a panel presentation and a detailed written profile that would run in the event's accompanying publication and be distributed to an audience of several thousand professionals across the industry. I said yes. I didn't tell many people. I mentioned it to Wesley, to Mitchell, to Garrett. I didn't post about it. I didn't build anticipation. I just prepared. The presentation itself was less dramatic than you might imagine. I'm not a performer. I've never been someone who lights up a room from a stage. What I am is someone who knows his material, speaks clearly, and can make a complicated idea feel accessible without making it feel small. I talked about the gap between operational appearance and operational reality, about why so many companies that look like they're scaling are actually fracturing internally, about what genuine infrastructure building requires versus what it's usually substituted with. The room was attentive. Afterward, an industry speaker named Grant told me it was one of the more grounded presentations he'd heard at a conference in years. He didn't mean it as a compliment about charisma. He meant it as a compliment about substance. That was the one I wanted. The written profile ran 3 weeks later. It included the company name, the founding story in broad strokes, the community initiative with Madison, the client outcomes, and a photograph. Just one, taken in the Midtown office space we'd started leasing that winter. A journalist named Sophia had written it with careful attention to detail. She'd spent 2 separate afternoons asking questions and had arrived at the piece with more nuance than I'd expected. The piece was picked up by 2 industry publications and shared widely in the professional circles where people in our space paid attention. I read it once, thought it was fair and accurate, and went back to work. I found out how Morgan encountered it from Caitlin. Caitlin messaged me on a Thursday evening in March, about 10 days after the profile had run. I wasn't going to say anything, she wrote, but I think you'd want to know. She told me that Morgan had come across the article through a shared professional contact, someone in the marketing world who had shared it in a LinkedIn post with a note about innovative consulting approaches. Morgan, apparently, had clicked through on the company name, read the whole piece, and then, according to Caitlin, had sat very quietly for a long time. Vanessa, who was predictably positioned at the center of that particular social information exchange, had apparently been with Morgan when it happened. Caitlin relayed it carefully, without embellishment. Morgan had read the profile, had seen the photograph, had recognized my name in the first paragraph where the founders were introduced, and had read all the way through to the end without saying anything. Then she'd set her phone down and said, "I didn't know he was doing this." Vanessa had asked what she meant. "Any of it," Morgan had said. "I didn't know he was doing any of it." Morgan's sister Sierra texted me the following Monday. Short, careful, sincere. "I saw the article. I'm really proud of you. I hope things are going well." I thanked her. I didn't ask what Morgan had said. I didn't need to. The part that I think Morgan hadn't anticipated, the part that probably landed with the particular weight that it did, wasn't the business success. It wasn't the profile. It wasn't the conference. It wasn't the client list or the investor or the initiative with Madison. It was the timeline. Because once she read the piece and understood how long we'd been building, the conversations with Wesley that had begun while we were still engaged, the incorporation that happened weeks after she left, the client relationships and the community work and the structural development that had all been happening quietly, without announcement, she would have understood something about those last months that she'd misread completely. She thought she was watching someone stand still. She had been watching someone lay a foundation. Brandon's situation had become clearer by that point. Not dramatically, not in a single revelation. But Morgan had begun to understand the difference between his life as it appeared and his life as it actually operated. The instability that had always been there, running below the surface. The gap between the altitude he projected and the ground he was actually standing on. I don't take any satisfaction in that. It's just what happened. Some things that look like everything are held together with far less than you'd think. Garrett called me in late March, about 2 weeks after the article had run. "You know she reached out to Caitlin," he said. "I know," I said. "She asked how you were doing." I let that sit for a moment. "What did Caitlin say?" I asked. "That you seemed good. That you seemed really good." "That's accurate," I said. Garrett was quiet for a second. "You're not going to do anything with this, are you?" It wasn't exactly a question. "No," I said. "Yeah," he said. I figured. There was a moment, I'll be honest, where I wondered what it would feel like to have the conversation she probably imagined having. The version where she reaches out and I'm gracious and measured, and she sees how far I've come and says something she means, and there's some kind of resolution that gives the whole story a cleaner shape. I thought about it for about an hour one evening in early April, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. And then I thought, to what end? I didn't want resolution with Morgan. I'd already arrived at my own. What I wanted was to keep building the thing I was building, to do more of the work, to grow the program with Madison, to expand the client base with Wesley, to eventually move groundwork into the kind of position where we could do things that mattered at a larger scale. That was the life I actually wanted, not closure with someone who had already left it. Mitchell and I had lunch in April, same place near Penn Station, same rotating menu of sandwiches we'd been working through for years. I told him about the response to the article, about Caitlin's message, about Sierra's text. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities. When I finished, he just said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it for a moment. "Exactly the same as I did before," I said. "Maybe a little tired." He nodded. "That's the right answer," he said. By summer, Groundwork Advisory had 6 active clients. We'd added an operations manager named Jordan and a public relations director named Lauren, both of whom understood exactly what we were building and why the approach mattered. We'd expanded the community initiative to 3 additional neighborhoods in partnership with Qley's organization. We were not yet the largest firm doing what we were doing, but we were doing it better than almost anyone else. And the people who paid attention to quality over scale were starting to notice. A board member named Natalie, who sat on the advisory board of one of the industry organizations that had covered us, reached out to Wesley in June about a potential strategic partnership. An event organizer named Olivia was already asking about featuring us at the following year's conference, not as a case study this time, but as lead presenters. None of this was what I'd imagined when I was standing in that kitchen holding my college mug, listening to Morgan tell me I was too ordinary. It was better, because it wasn't performance. It wasn't appearance. It was real. I still have the ring. I haven't done anything with it. It's still in the velvet box in the top drawer of my dresser, which is now in a different apartment. A place I moved into the previous autumn, closer to Midtown, quieter than I expected, with a small second bedroom I've converted into a workspace. I don't think about it much, but occasionally I take it out and hold it for a moment. Not with grief, not with anger, just with something like acknowledgement. It's a reminder of a version of my life I was planning and why those plans ended and what it turned out was on the other side of that ending. I put it back and close the drawer, and I go back to work. I never spoke to Morgan again, not from bitterness. Not from strategy. There was simply nothing left to say. She had made her choice clearly and without apology, which was at least honest. I had made my peace with it, which was the only response that made sense. The distance between where I was now and where we'd been together was the kind of distance that doesn't welcome bridges. Some endings are supposed to stay ended. That one was. What I know now that I didn't fully know then is this. Extraordinary isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear the right watch or live in the right building or move through rooms in a way that turns heads. It doesn't require an audience. It's built in the hours before most people are awake, in the conversations that go nowhere visible, in the months of careful, patient, unglamorous work that creates the foundation everything else eventually stands on. Morgan wanted to see extraordinary. She was looking for it in the wrong places, and in the wrong ways, and in entirely the wrong person. I don't blame her. I really don't. She wanted something specific, a version of a life she could see and feel and point to. I understand that impulse. I just couldn't give it to her in the form she needed, in the time frame she needed it. And she couldn't wait for the version that was actually coming. That's not anyone's villain story. It's just a mismatch. The last I heard, Morgan had moved out of Brandon's apartment by early summer. She was back in Brooklyn, working, starting over in her own way. I hope she finds whatever she's actually looking for. I mean that without irony, without satisfaction, without any of the complicated emotional weather that might have come with it a year earlier. I just genuinely hope she finds it. Because I did. She chased the life that looked extraordinary and walked away from the man who was actually creating it. She'll know that now. And I'll know something too. Something I carry without needing to say it out loud to anyone. That the best answer to someone who doesn't believe in you isn't a speech. It isn't a confrontation. It isn't a moment of public vindication or a perfectly timed reveal. It's just the quiet, persistent, undeniable weight of becoming exactly who you always intended to be. One day at a time. With nobody watching. And not needing them to.